Can I ask everyone, please, from the public galleries who are leaving, to now do so very quickly and quietly? Thank you very much. The next item of business is a members' business debate on motion 4130 in the name of Ben Macpherson on justice for Yazidi people. The debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Ben Macpherson to open the debate. Around 7 minutes, please, Mr Macpherson.
Presiding Officer, today we stand united against terrorism and in solidarity with all of those affected by such extremism and crimes against humanity. I would like to thank the Presiding Officer for securing debate time on the genocide of the Yazidi people and for recognising this issue as a matter of real importance to us all, as internationalists and as human beings. Recently, I visited a remarkable organisation called Multicultural Family Base in my constituency. And during this visit, I heard about some of the work that they are doing to support Syrian refugees who are making Edinburgh their home, some of whom are from the Yazidi community. In one conversation, a support worker from the family base spoke about a Yazidi child now living in this city who, before fleeing Syria, witnessed his family being shot and killed in front of him. A child. No one should have to witness such horror and brutality, but least of all a child. The story was not only understandably upsetting, but also reminded me of why the Yazidi genocide is so important to us all. Not only because of our common humanity, but because there are survivors of this genocide living with us here in Scotland. Genocide is an odious scourge which has inflicted great losses on humanity and is one of the most heinous crimes under international law and the law of civilized nations. And make no mistake, the issue before us today is one of genocide, as defined under the 1948 Genocide Convention. A genocide committed against the Yazidi community by the fascists in the form of Daesh. This atrocious violence began in August 2014, when Daesh overran the town of Sinjar in northern Iraq. Since then, it is estimated that approximately 10,000 Yazidis have been murdered, with as many as 40,000 currently seeking refuge. Yazidi community leaders in Iraq have horrifically reported the discovery of mass graves containing thousands of bodies. And what makes this issue even more appalling is that Daesh are carrying out a campaign to erase the identity of the Yazidis, who follow a unique and ancient faith that is detested by Daesh. As well as acts of murder in pursuing their barbaric and horrific determination to ethnically cleanse the region of Yazidis, Daesh are forcibly running a conversion campaign, with Yazidi males being forced to change their religion and Yazidi females being treated as sex slaves. It is reported that as many as 7,000 Yazidi women have been captured as sex slaves, and while rape has been used as a weapon of war before, the scale and the nature of the recent and current violence against the Yazidis is gruesomely unprecedented. Among those 7,000 women captured by Daesh was 21-year-old Nadia Murad. After successfully escaping Daesh's camps, she has courageously spoken out about the suffering and torture endured by her and her fellow Yazidis. As a human rights activist, Nobel Peace Prize nominee, and UN Goodwill Ambassador, Nadia Murad has campaigned bravely and effectively for the Yazidi cause. Survivors like Nadia Murad have spoken out about how Daesh has imposed the institutional practice of slavery within its so-called caliphate, and how they grotesquely encourage the systematic rape and sexual enslavement of non-Muslim women. Young Yazidi women are treated as commodities, heinously distributed among Daesh militants. As mentioned earlier, Yazidi children have also suffered at the hands of Daesh. Yazidi are an NGO in the US and here in the UK who are responding to the needs of the Yazidi community. They have reported that Yazidi male children, aged between 5 and 15 years old, are separated from their families by Daesh and transferred forcibly to locations in Iraq and Syria to receive religious and military indoctrination and become so-called cubs of the caliphate. Not only are these boys taught how to use guns and rockets, they are forcibly and twistedly shown violent graphics to manipulate them to be violent and hateful towards their own community. In response to all of this brutality, here in Scotland, and as a people that are strongly committed to human dignity, human rights and equality, as a country who celebrate cultural, religious, linguistic and ethnic diversity, here in Scotland, we must condemn these atrocious acts of extreme human suffering towards the Yazidi men, women and children, and call upon those with power to confront the bigotry, brutality and religious intolerance of Daesh. I welcome the efforts of Iraq, Greece, Turkey, Canada, Germany and Britain to provide refuge to Yazidis. However, it should be noted that there are still thousands of Yazidis in Daesh captivity who are suffering unthinkable grief and torture as we speak today. And while I would like to commend the actions of the US Congress, the European Parliament, the French Senate, the UN and the UK Parliament in formally recognising the Yazidi genocide, I also call on the UK government and others to take immediate and resolute action to support international efforts to prevent further atrocities against the Yazidi people and to meet international obligations to provide greater refuge to those at risk of persecution. I also call on the UK government to request that the UN Security Council refer the genocide committed against the Yazidi people to the International Criminal Court, which Nadia Murad and her lawyer Amal Clooney have been courageously pressuring for in recent weeks and months. I call on the international community to order an investigation into the genocide and begin to gather evidence to document Daesh's crimes against humanity, refer the matter to the International Criminal Court and seek legal justice for the Yazidi people. Presiding Officer, genocide is a word that should be consigned to the history books. But until it is, we must not turn a blind eye when we see it in our world. The crimes that Daesh have committed against the Yazidis must be confronted, and the pain and suffering that innocent Yazidis have endured and are still enduring today must be addressed. And so let us do our part. Let us send a strong and united message from this Parliament to the international community that Scotland stands firmly in solidarity with and in support of the Yazidi community. And let us send another important message to Daesh that their crimes will not go unpunished and that it is the will of this Parliament that their terrorist, fascist organisation will be brought to justice at the International Criminal Court. Let us do what we can to stand up for the Yazidi people and protect and support our fellow human beings.
We now move to the open speeches and speeches of no more than 4 minutes, please. I call Alexander Anderson to be followed. I seem to really want to change your name to Anderson, don't I, Mr. Stewart? You must remind me of someone in my past or something. I call on Alexander Stewart to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As I've said before, I answer to many things, but I'll try and give you something in the future that reminds you that I'm a Stewart. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I congratulate Ben McPherson on highlighting the issue today on the crimes committed against the Yazidi people and congratulate him on securing this debate here today. I think it's important that we give an opportunity to have it here. The plight of the Yazidi people is, without question, very difficult for some of us to comprehend. It's as if we're going back to a darker time in our history. You know, we're living in 2017, and the atrocities that we're hearing about are so hideous that it's, as I say, incomprehensible for individuals living today. So, Deputy Presiding Officer, the so-called Islamic State have enslaved and killed thousands of Yazidi people and forced them to take on board these horrific situations that they find themselves in. And more than 400,000 Yazidi people have fled and become refugees, and they've taken up in camps in Iraq, Greece, Syria and Turkey. The crimes perpetrated by Daesh go beyond the atrocities of rape and murder themselves. They have set out to destroy an ancient culture. And in doing that, they want to erase that culture from every part of the globe. Ministers in the United Kingdom Government, including the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Tobias Ellwood, have been clear that they believe that genocide has taken place and that has to be taken to the authorities and used. And I commend what the member is trying to achieve. The United Kingdom is committed to supporting efforts to gather and ensure that evidence can be put in front of courts that show that the law has been persecuted and individuals have been subject to these horrific situations. And the UN has to design a system for us to collect that evidence and to ensure that that evidence can be put in a court of law. The forced sexual enslavement of Yazidi women and the so-called Islamic State of another it's a horrific situation that these women find themselves in. You know, it's modern slavery. Now, we're well aware that there is a significant problem in other parts of the globe as well with reference to slavery. And we've even got indications of what is happening here in the United Kingdom, Deputy Presiding Officer. So this is a situation that all governments have to embrace and take on board. The UK government is committed to combating modern slavery and human trafficking, and the Prime Minister has committed £33.5 million to a fund to aid the programme to ensure that it is tackled at the root cause. The vast majority of international communities are opposed to Daesh and every part of their ethos and what they are trying to achieve. While they have failed to create a state, they have continued to terrorise people throughout the Middle East and to attack innocent civilians across the globe. In September last year, in collaboration with the counterparts in Belgium and Iraq, the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, launched a global campaign to hold Daesh to account for their crimes. And that has to take place. The governments across the world have to unite. The UK government is working closely with partner international agencies and will bring these to fruition. And I look forward to seeing what plans are being proposed by governments and parliaments across the world. In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, the crimes perpetrated by IS against these individuals are abhorrent and that everyone in this chamber utterly condemns them. The United Kingdom is working constructively with international partners to fulfil a moral obligation to ensure that the suffering that is presently taking place is combated. And I would do all we can to secure that that happens. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. Now call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Lewis MacDonald.
Presiding Officer, and first of all, I'd like to thank my colleague Ben McPherson for lodging this motion and securing debating time on this matter, the importance and poignancy of which should strike a note with anyone who holds justice dear, particularly given the appalling events in London of less than 24 hours ago. Genocide is universally acknowledged as one of the most abhorrent acts, rightly considered the crime above all crimes, and is something, as history has taught us, must never be ignored. It is therefore of vital importance that the genocide perpetrated against the defenceless Yazidi people by Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, be recognised and condemned as such on an international level. The peaceful Yazidis have suffered in previous times persecution, but never has an outright policy of extermination and assimilation been launched against them with such violence. The abhorrent and unprovoked display of violence, which began on August 2014 with ISIL occupation of the predominantly Yazidi inhabited town of Sinjar, resulted in the necessary deaths of thousands and what has been described by the UN as the largest mass kidnapping seen this century. By the end of August 2014, 1,600 to 1,800 or more Yazidis had been murdered, executed or died from starvation while fleeing. This number has risen steadily with every new report published, and by August last year, at least 72 mass graves had been discovered containing up to 15,000 victims of slaughter, exposed as ISIL's caliphate retreats before advancing Iraqi forces. Along with forced conversion of Yazidi males, ISIL detained 5,000 to 7,000 Yazidi women as slaves or forced brides. The sexual slavery that has taken place since the unprovoked attack is appalling, and many slave markets still exist in the diminishing territory still controlled by ISIL, generating millions of dollars for its illegitimate terrorist state. Sexual violence has been used as a weapon of war in the most barbaric way. Decisions made by the US Congress, European Parliament, French Senate and the UN, among other organisations, to formally recognise these horrors as genocide have shown we are making some progress towards justice for the Yazidi people. The House of Commons also defied the UK Government to vote 278 to 0 in favour of declaring the attacks an act of genocide, calling on ministers to refer the atrocities to the UN. Despite this progress, the United Nations estimates that in this third year following events, 3,200 women and children are still held captive in horrific circumstances. Therefore, the international community should continue to work collaboratively to offer what protection and aid it can to the Yazidi people. And a display of solidarity, I hope, will be mirrored in many societies, including our own. Last year, Germany opened its doors to more than 1,000 Yazidi women and children who had managed to escape ISIL. Many witnesses and victims have also called for the UK Government's current resettlement programme that aims to admit 20,000 vulnerable people fleeing conflict in Syria to be extended to Yazidis. In October 2016, 2 Yazidi women who survived and escaped sexual enslavement by ISIL were awarded the EU's prestigious Sakharov Human Rights Prize, as Ben McPherson has pointed out. Nadia Murad and Lamia Ali Bashar have inspirationally spoke out about the horrors they faced at the hands of the militant group, therefore raising awareness and giving a voice to the voiceless. Yazda, an NGO that supports the Yazidi community in Iraq, recognised this as a cause for celebration, but respectfully added, and I quote, "We sincerely hope that the international community will turn more attention to the thousands of Yazidi women and children still in captivity, the thousands of Yazidi men whose whereabouts remain unknown to their families, and the hundreds of thousands of Yazidis who remain displaced in Iraq and elsewhere and are unable to return to their homelands and begin rebuilding their lives." Scotland is undoubtedly committed to upholding human dignity, human rights and fundamental equality. Our country welcomes and celebrates diversity in all its forms. In the face of despicable brutality, promoting tolerance and acknowledging the unimaginable human suffering and loss that can be inflicted by bigotry, brutality and religious intolerance has never been more significant. Presiding Officer, ISIL has made clear that it intends to destroy the Yazidis completely through killings, forced conversions and rapes. Organisations and governments across the globe increasingly recognise that genocide has been committed against the Yazidis. Victims in Ladia and Lamia want the chance to face their abusers in court and deserve nothing less. As such, there is no doubt the UK Government should request that the UN Security Council refer this genocide to the International Criminal Court in order to ensure adequate punishment for those who have committed such barbarities. Resolute and immediate action to prevent these events repeating themselves must be taken, as there is no valid excuse for ignorance or for failing to act.
I have Lewis MacDonald, followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you very much. I too thank Ben McPherson for bringing this debate today. The day after Daesh-inspired murder came to Westminster Bridge and New Palace Yards, our thoughts go to all the victims of those murders and their families around the world. Daesh is an organisation dedicated to killing all who stand in their way. Their objective is to create a state built on violence, falsely claiming a connection with Islam and Sharia law, but in reality representing only the rule of brutal and angry men who are at war with us all. They have made or inspired attacks in more than 30 countries around the world, murdering over 2,000 people in the last 3 years alone. Many thousands more have died where Daesh has deployed military force in Syria and in Iraq. The Yazidi population of Sinjar in Iraq has been assailed by a campaign of annihilation that has rightly been designated as genocide and a crime against humanity. The murder of men and boys by the thousand, the enslavement and rape of like numbers of women and girls, the stealing of children and the destruction of villages have all been intended to eliminate the Yazidis as a people. This attempted genocide, like the atrocities against Christians, Shia Muslims and ethnic minorities across the region show that self-styled Islamic State do not represent the true Islamic faith in any way. Far from a caliphate of the faithful, they would create a hell on earth. We should commend the courage and determination of the Yazidi people wherever they have taken refuge and help them reclaim their homes. History tells us that genocide does not just happen out of the blue, that Daesh is only the latest vehicle for murderous hatred in Iraq. It was the regime of Saddam Hussein which turned an ancient cradle of civilization into a prison state, run by men who killed with impunity, sent out their agents to murder opponents around the world, and brought genocidal violence to a land of many faiths and many cultures. Saddam Hussein's war on Iran cost 1 million Muslim lives. As that war ended, his regime visited genocidal violence on the Kurdish population of northern Iraq. At Halabja, on the 16th of March 1988, they used mustard gas, cyanide and sarin to kill 5,000 defenceless civilians and to injure 10,000 more. The chief culprit that day was Ali Hassan Abd al-Majid, cousin to Saddam Hussein, better known as Chemical Ali. Like his cousin, he was tried and eventually executed for his crimes. But many of the culprits of Halabja and the wider Anfal campaign against the Kurds remain unpunished. At least 100 former officers in Saddam's army are now to be found in the ranks of Daesh, doing to Sinjar today what they did to the Halabja 29 years ago. It was because such men were not brought to justice then that they are free to commit their crimes again. This time, they must be pursued with vigour and punished for what they have done. Those whose actions or reckless inaction have allowed those crimes to happen must also be held to account. Right now, the current elected government of Iraq has to give a lead in securing justice for all its citizens. Human rights lawyer Amal Clooney, referred to by Ben McPherson, spoke on behalf of Yazidi women at the United Nations in New York 2 weeks ago. She called on Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi to send the letter to the Security Council which it needs in order to trigger an investigation of the crimes of Daesh in Iraq. We should give our support to that call today. I hope the Minister can say so in closing this debate, so that justice can begin to be done for the Yazidis and for all those who have suffered murderous violence in that country in the last 50 years.
I call Ross Greer to be followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Like colleagues, I'd like to thank Ben McPherson for bringing the atrocities inflicted on the Yazidi people to the attention of this Parliament and allowing us to raise them here today. As colleagues may be aware, I convene the Parliament's cross-party group on Kurdistan, and the Yazidis are, of course, an ethnically Kurdish people, and until the genocide largely resided in Iraqi Kurdistan. They've endured a long history of oppression due to their ethnicity and their unique faith, as Mr McPherson's already mentioned. But the events of 2014 and the ongoing atrocities have marked what is perhaps the darkest period in the recent history of the Yazidi people. In August of 2014, when Daesh made sweeping advances across Iraq and Syria, they came quickly to Sinjar, the home of many Yazidi people. Hundreds of thousands fled the city, many of whom were already refugees from the fighting elsewhere, including the mostly Yazidi population. And like Kurds have done so many times in their history, they fled to the mountains for safety. Those who stayed and fought could not hold back the barbarians who swept through the city and began massacring the residents. 40,000 of those who fled were cut off and surrounded on Mount Sinjar, largely children and the elderly who could not escape quickly enough. Those stuck on the mountain had little to no water, were surrounded by monsters intent on their slaughter, and had no means of escape. Some who had previously been captured and raped by Daesh were so traumatized by the thought of it happening again that they threw themselves from the cliffs rather than be taken. At this point, the now prevailing narrative is that the international community woke up and, led by the US, the UK and Iraqi forces, began dropping emergency aid onto the mountain and evacuating as many as they could by helicopter, all under fire from the Daesh positions below. That's true, but it ignores the very reason that Daesh never made it to the top of the mountain and continued their massacre. That was the Kurds who rescued their Yazidi cousins. The Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK, have been locked in a conflict with the Turkish state for some decades, but that debate and their history is for another time. Despite having nothing more than an infantry force equipped with light weapons, the PKK raced across northern Iraq and did what others were not doing. They put themselves between Daesh and 40,000 people on that mountain. PKK fighters, men and women, joined by the YPJ Kurdish forces from northern Syria, moved in tractors and other vehicles and evacuated between 20 and 30,000 people from Mount Sinjar and into Kurdish-controlled northern Syria before repatriating them back into Iraq once it was safe. I do not say this to detract from the efforts of the Iraqi Peshmerga or the US or UK helicopter crews who did risk their lives flying emergency aid in and refugees out. But their story has already been well told. The striking footage of helicopter crews dragging refugees on board while firing back at Daesh positions played out in media outlets across the globe. But the stories of those volunteers on the ground did not. Not only did Kurdish forces, the PKK and the YPJ, later joined by Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga, rescue those stranded in the mountain, they took back Sinjar, they drove Daesh out at great cost, and they continue to fight to regain their homes. In northern Syria, where the Kurds have built a democratic, feminist, multi-ethnic and multicultural society, many Yazidis have joined the self-defence forces set up for them, received training, and to this day take part in the struggle to rid their region of the scourge of Daesh. I say this not to glorify war. It's horrific, it's tragic, and this conflict in particular has shocked us all with its brutality, but rather to highlight the defiance of the Yazidi people, victims of genocide who have joined with other Kurds, Arabs, Assyrians, Turkmen, Muslims, Christians, and others, not just to defeat the hatred, but to build in its place a society built on values of equality, tolerance, and democracy. And I'm sure that we all have nothing but admiration for that.
Before I call Ms Maguire, we do have another 3 speakers, which will take us over allotted time. So I'm minded to accept a motion under Rule 8.14.3 to extend the debate by up to 30 minutes. Can I invite Ben McPherson, please, to make such a motion?
Formally moved.
Thank you very much. So the question is, are members agreed that we extend this debate? Good, that's agreed. Can I call Ruth Maguire, please, to be followed by Annie Wells?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm deeply grateful to my colleague Ben McPherson for bringing this hugely important and urgent topic to the chamber of our Scottish Parliament. The horrifying systematic murder and torture of the Yazidi people at the hands of ISIS has been recognised as genocide by institutions and countries across the world, from the United Nations and the European Union to the USA, the UK and France. I'm proud that today Scotland will add its voice to the international cry of condemnation of the genocide being perpetrated by ISIS against the Yazidi people, and join the ranks of those nations and institutions standing up for their justice and human rights. Just a few weeks ago, we marked International Women's Day with a debate in this chamber. We reflected on how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Reading about the plight of Yazidi women and girls in particular, I was forcefully reminded of the scale of the battle that still faces us when it comes to protecting the rights and safety of women across the world. In pursuit of its abhorrent and deliberate policy of ethnic cleansing, ISIS has separated hundreds of young women and girls, some as young as 12, from their families. They've been sold, given as gifts, or forced to marry ISIS fighters and supporters. Many have been subject to torture, rape, sexual violence and forced into sexual slavery. An IS pamphlet produced for its supporters has the following to say about unbelieving women, such as Yazidi women and girls who've been captured. If she is a virgin, he, her master, can have intercourse with her immediately after taking possession of her. However, if she isn't, her uterus must be purified first. It is permissible to buy, sell, or give as a gift female captives and slaves, for they are merely property, which can be disposed of. It is permissible to have intercourse with the female slave who hasn't reached puberty if she is fit for intercourse. However, if she is not fit for intercourse, that it is enough to enjoy her without intercourse. Presiding Officer, as difficult as it is to say or hear those words, the horror of the reality of them is even more unthinkable. Many of us will have seen the video of Iraqi Yazidi MP Vian Dakhil, who broke down into heart-wrenching tears in her own parliament, and she pleaded with her parliament and the international community, save us from ISIS. Now, all colleagues across the chamber will daily hear upsetting and difficult stories from our constituents about challenges and hardship they have in their lives. But, Presiding Officer, I can't even begin to comprehend having to come to this chamber and beg my colleagues to help me protect the people that I represent in Ayrshire from rape, torture and slaughter. ISIS is committing war crimes, it's committing crimes against humanity, and it's perpetrating genocide. Not only that, but it's boasting about doing so. We can't stand by and allow this to continue. It must stop. The UK Government can request that the UN Security Council refer the genocide committed against the Yazidi people to the International Criminal Court. And I hope that it listens to both the calls of this Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament and acts. The genocide must stop and justice must be achieved.
I call Annie Wells to be followed by Johann Lamont.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Before I thank Ben, can I just say Ruth Maguire's speech there was very moving, very thought-provoking, and I just wanted to say thank you very much for sharing that information, some of which I didn't know. I would also like to thank Ben McPherson for bringing the debate to the Chamber today. The Yazidi people have been made the unfortunate subjects of centuries of oppression. In the modern day, although many have now fled to Australia, Canada and Germany, Iraq is now the one place where a sizable community still exists. Against the odds, and the Yazidi people remain under constant threat from the Islamic State campaign of murder, repression and violence. I am in absolute agreement that we need to do our utmost to prevent the constant threat Yazidi people now face from Daesh fighters. And I agree, as did my UK party colleagues last May, that the actions of Daesh equate to genocide, and that is why I shall be supporting the motion today. The international community is united in defeating Daesh, and as a result, we have seen thousands of people freed from their rule. Despite these small successes, however, the threat very much remains. Although Daesh has failed to create a state, it has not yet been defeated as a terrorist organisation. As we've already heard today, over 3,200 Yazidi women and children are still held by ISIS. Females are being sexually enslaved and Yazidi boys indoctrinated, trained and used in hostilities. This occurs while thousands of Yazidi men and boys remain missing. We owe it to these people to take action. It was a Conservative member, Fiona Bruce MP, who brought forward a motion on this issue last April. She said, I quote, that the proposers of this motion are here to insist that the overwhelming evidence of the atrocities of Daesh in Syria and Iraq is recognised for the genocide it is and is considered as such by the UN Security Council and the International Criminal Court. This will support similar resolutions of other leading international and legislative bodies. And this is why I was pleased to see Alexander also highlighted that the Foreign Minister, alongside counterparts from Belgium and Iraq, launching a global campaign last year to hold Daesh to account for these horrendous crimes. The British Government is working with its international partners, in particular the Government of Iraq, to bring forward a proposal at the UN to put the campaign into action, and good progress is being made across the United Nations on designing a system whereby evidence can be collected to bring Daesh to justice. As a backdrop to this, the UK Government is also providing our country's largest ever response to a single humanitarian crisis. It has now pledged a total of over £2.3 billion to alleviate immediate humanitarian suffering through the provision of food, medical care and relief items to over 1 million people affected. Presiding Officer, once again, I'd like to thank Ben McPherson for bringing this very important issue to the Chamber today and wish to reiterate my support for ensuring we do our utmost to prevent them. Thank you.
And the last of the open speeches is Johann Lamont.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I say that I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate, and can I thank everyone here who has made such powerful speeches, both showing a degree of knowledge and passion about a subject that I think is worthy of this place, and I hope that people outside this chamber will take the opportunity to read these speeches and to learn about what is happening to the Yazidi people. And I do particularly want to congratulate Ben McPherson both on his securing this debate and on his powerful speech. But particularly I appreciate that he's brought into the public domain the suffering of the Yazidi people, a suffering of which many of us have all too hazy a knowledge. We can recall incidents, we can remember something on the television, but as the cameras moved on, so have we. And we do live in a world with 24-hour news, but sadly, we do not live in a world of 24 hours attention. And too often atrocities across the world are picked up, we pay attention, and then we move on. And we know that it's important that we shine a light on such atrocities if justice is to be secured. And at this time, when we have seen the horror of a terror attack in London, we are particularly mindful of the consequences of terror and hatred across our communities. But it is important when we discuss genocide that we look at the pattern of behaviour and the bigger picture that brings genocide upon a people. Such horrendous atrocities are it's hard to fathom the scale of the suffering that people have suffered, or indeed of the motives of those who commit genocide. What is it that takes people to create such suffering as they step beyond their own humanity? We see in Daesh people who have left their humanity behind. They destroy the physical evidence of civilization as they seek to destroy peoples and faiths and those of whom they have decided they have no, believe have no place within their society. But of course, the big lesson of genocide is that it's not a single event. It doesn't start with massacre. It doesn't start with mass graves. It starts with simple steps of othering people, of talking about the differences, of labelling people, dehumanising people, preparing for genocide, and then conducting it, and then critically denying that it is happening. And I'm privileged to be a member of the board of Remembering Srebrenica Scotland, and that is a campaign that has been created to insist that genocide is understood, that the steps to genocide are understood, and the scale to which those committing genocide will go in order to deny their own crimes. In Bosnia, the mass graves did not just simply represent slaughter, they also represented the desire of those committing genocide to hide their crimes. And those forensic scientists, some of them wonderful people from within our own communities in Scotland, have piece by piece established that that genocide took place. And later this year, there will be an opportunity to mark again the evidence and experience of the people of Srebrenica and beyond in Bosnia, and their desire is to speak of genocide so that we understand it wherever is experienced and wherever is expressed. And this year the theme, and I think it is an important theme that they have for their memorials this year, is breaking the silence on gender and genocide. Because we know in Bosnia, as indeed with the Yazidi people, there was a terrible slaughter visited upon the men and boys, but the women of Srebrenica, as in so many genocides, have seen themselves as victims of war, where rape and sexual violence of women have become a weapon of war, and so tellingly and so powerfully described by my colleague on the other benches. That is the way in which genocide operates, the steps towards it, and then the utter dehumanising of men and women violence, sexual violence becoming a norm, a horrific norm in their lives. And I want to conclude on just simply making two final points, if I may, Deputy Presiding Officer. We live in a very fragile world, and I think of the things that the new President Trump has said. The one that has scared me most is his comments that he would want to reduce the amount of funding that they would give as a nation to the United Nations. At this time, more than any, we need our international institutions to be strong, to take on those who would commit violence, atrocities, genocide against vulnerable people like the Yazidis that we have heard today. And the second point I would make is the need for our vigilance, to understand where the small steps can take you. And a message from a Bosnian refugee who said that we should welcome refugees who bring not only with them their suffering, but an understanding of how violence and hatred can destroy communities and how states can collapse in the face of genocide, who know where hatred can take you, and we need their wisdom now. Can I thank again Ben McPherson for this very important debate. We stand in solidarity with the Yazidi people, but also in our determination to do what we can to call out the violence and hatred that leads to the genocide that has too often damaged and destroyed people in our communities across this world.
I now call Alistair Allen to close this debate. Around 7 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me begin, as others have done, by thanking Ben McPherson for lodging the motion and for securing this very important debate on justice for the Yazidi people. And of course, we debate it on a day when we remember all victims of terror and seek to build the understanding that we need to overcome that terror. I want to put on record the Scottish Government's own condemnation of the crimes perpetrated against the Yazidi people, a condemnation voiced by members today and which clearly, I would suggest, is the view of this Parliament. Ours is a government and a parliament that stands in solidarity with the Yazidi people. Indeed, ours is a nation which recognises its duty to stand in defence of human rights and equality and human dignity and minority communities around the world. So let me go further. As members have so eloquently reminded us in this debate, the Yazidi people have been victims of the most appalling crimes against humanity. Daesh is a monstrous criminal enterprise. It has perpetrated a long list of atrocities and war crimes and human rights abuses. No one has been safe. Kurds and Arabs, Muslims and Christians, civilians, the young, the old. And of course, David Haines and Alan Henning were murdered because they sought to bring humanitarian aid to those in need. But in its campaign of hatred against the Yazidi people, Daesh has gone even further. It has exceeded even its own record of brutality. It has committed the ultimate and unforgivable crime. In its fanatical desire to impose a corrupt and twisted interpretation of one of the world's great religious traditions, it has sought to destroy an entire minority culture, an entire faith, and an entire people. What the Yazidi people have suffered merits condemnation in the strongest possible terms. And today's debate has demonstrated that the Scottish Parliament is in no doubt about the matter. Daesh has committed and is continuing to commit genocide against the Yazidi people and against other religious and ethnic minorities. As we have heard, there is robust and unequivocal evidence that Yazidi men, women and children have been the victims of a campaign of murder, rape, abduction, sexual slavery, brutality and terror at the hands of Daesh in Iraq and Syria. The UN has confirmed that 5,000 Yazidi men have been executed and thousands of men and boys are still missing. Over 3,500 Yazidi women have been kidnapped by Daesh, with multiple reports, as we've heard mentioned today, of sexual violence against women in detention and women living in Daesh-controlled areas. According to a UN report, the attacks on the Yazidis, which continue until the present day, are committed pursuant to an explicit ideological policy of the terrorist group, whose radical religious interpretation does not permit the existence of Yazidism within the territory it controls. According to some estimates, 70,000 people, or about 15% of the Yazidi population in Iraq, have fled the country with many seeking asylum in Europe. The Yazidis themselves are in no doubt that their entire religion is being wiped off the face of the earth. This is a matter which needs urgently to be taken before the UN Security Council, before one of Iraq's oldest religious and cultural communities is exterminated. That, I believe, is the overwhelming view of members around this chamber. It is also, as Annie Wells alluded to, the view expressed in the House of Commons in April last year. I have to say that, like Mr Macpherson, I am disappointed that the UK Government remains so reluctant to promote action at UN level to ensure that the genocide committed against the Yazidi people is referred to the International Criminal Court. That reluctance does not sit comfortably with the responsibility we all of us have to lead and to act in defence of human rights and human dignity. Presiding Officer, in Scotland, we are, I hope, and as we regularly and rightly say, an outward-looking and welcoming nation. The Scottish Parliament has spoken out against actions here today that amount to and are genocide. We speak out lest we forget the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust. We speak out because the world must act to prevent the repetition of the horrors we have seen visited upon Cambodia and Rwanda and Srebrenica, Halabja and Darfur. And we speak out because we know that such crimes continue to be committed, not just in Iraq and Syria, but in South Sudan, where personal greed, the thirst of power, and a poisonous cocktail of political rivalry and ethnic violence have created a new humanitarian disaster.
Lewis MacDonald.
Nice. He wants also to address wider issues. Before moving on from the issue of the Yazidis in Iraq, does he accept that the critical next step in terms of enforcement action by the United Nations is for the Iraqi government to take, and will he join the call that I made earlier that the Iraqi government should now take that step and send that letter to the Security Council?
Alistair Allen.
Yes, I believe that the Iraqi government bear responsibility in that area as well, and I think that all of us should seek to ensure that these are crimes which come before the UN and indeed come before international courts. We speak out, as I say, about not disasters. We speak out about humanitarian disasters that are in many cases caused directly because of genocide. And we can't afford to pay mere lip service to the idea of human rights, of equality, of human dignity. We must live by the principles of tolerance, dignity and respect, and why we must never be complacent about prejudice, discrimination and hatred. This debate has been an opportunity to make a public statement of solidarity with the Yazidi people and with other oppressed peoples and communities around the world. As a nation, we have a responsibility to be a good global citizen and to protect the world's most vulnerable people. And in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I can say that today's debate has made clear that the Scottish Parliament recognises and condemns the genocide perpetrated against the Yazidi people. We have united across party political lines to do so, and in doing so we also join with the United Nations and with other parliaments, Westminster, the US Congress, the French Senate and the European Parliament, in expressing both our condemnation and our solidarity.
This meeting is suspended until 2:30 p.m, the debate being concluded.